Hi, my name is Reva, Bhalla, and today I'm joined by my colleague Rodger Baker to discuss an upcoming Stratfor report on the future of Japan. So, Rodger, you worked with one of our leading East Asia analysts, John Minnick, on a very ambitious report to look at Japan 25 years out, a very long-term forecast. So perhaps the best way to start in looking at the future of Japan is to start with the past. And in this report, we talk about how Japan is essentially in a phase of breaking out of this post-Cold War order. How would you define the post-Cold War order for our readers and viewers, and how did Japan get there?
Well, I think we need to look first at Japan in the pre-war period and how Japan came into this space. And so as Japan entered into the international community, as it became less an isolationist state and became very active, first in response to European colonialism, and then as response to the changing dynamics of the balance of global power, Japan became a very assertive nation in East Asia. It sought to effectively mimic the European colonial role in Asia as an Asian power doing it within the region. World War II obviously ended that for the Japanese. And coming out of World War II, Japan became locked into the U.S. security and economic alliance to balance against the Soviet Union and in part against China at the time as well. And one of the trade-offs in Japan was that Japan agreed to not have a military. Now, Japan did have defense forces. It did have capabilities, but it renounced the right to collective self-defense, something that it was guaranteed by the United Nations. And it did so in order that the United States would provide protection and Japan would be able to focus on economic reconstruction, economic growth.
And the U.S. was providing significant economic assistance to Japan at the time as well.
Well, the U.S. encouraged this. So the U.S. effectively gave Japan free access to the U.S. markets. The U.S. provided security for Japan, and Japan as a geographic location became the perfect place to bottle in the Soviet Pacific Fleet, seal up Asia, and allow the United States in many ways to focus on the Soviet threat in Europe without having to be so concerned about what the Soviets could do out in the Pacific theater. And for Japan, this was very effective. For the United States, this was a very effective relationship. As the Cold War drew near an end, and by the mid-1980s, the Japanese economy had become the second largest economy in the world, had become starting to challenge in many ways the U.S. economy, maybe not directly in size, but certainly in the perception of Japan growing. The idea in the United States is children had to learn Japanese. They had to start studying science and technology because the United States was being left behind the Japanese.
Right. What is now China, essentially, for the
Right.
US.
This is the same, the mimic model of what China seems to be doing at the moment. And the United States decided, even with the security situation, that it was going to effectively yank the rug out from underneath the Japanese economically. Now, in part, this was because China had changed sides in the Cold War by this point. And that had given the United States the freedom to be able to pull back on their support for the Japanese because the Chinese in some way were now serving as that blocking force against the Soviets in the Asia Pacific. And with that, Japan started to move into its economic crisis. Now, at first, it was perceived that Japan was growing even faster. So as you lead up into 1990, even into 1991 in some ways, Japan was buying up everything around the world. They were buying real estate everywhere. What was seen, though, as massive growth was actually massive insecurity on the return of capital in Japan. They were putting as much money abroad as they possibly could.
Again, like China today.
We will see lots of parallels.
Sure.
So that put Japan into a position where it then went into its economic decline. It hit its economic decline pretty much at the same time that the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union broke apart. There was really no perceived Soviet threat. China was still not seen as a major challenger internationally. And so effectively, Japan sort of became internalized again. And this is it's done in the past in history as well, where it just sort of goes introverted. And in many ways, it wasn't a big challenge for the Japanese because their economy was still large. It didn't grow much, but it didn't really shrink. The population wasn't really growing. So effectively, the standard of living stayed the same. GDP per capita stayed the same. Certain Japanese industries continued to dominate internationally, even as you had competition from the South Koreans, from Taiwan, and slowly over time from China.
So, in other words, I mean, Japan has been stagnant for a very long time. It hasn't really grown since 1994. And so a lot of people like to talk about Japan in crisis, but it's a qualified crisis, right? As you said, it's still, third largest GDP in the world, one of the highest GDP per capita in the world. So when we talk about Japan breaking out of the post-Cold War foundering, what does that mean? What exactly is it breaking out of? What are the priorities?
So the challenge for Japan is to say, is it acceptable to continue to remain in this somewhat stagnant position? And is it okay just to stay at the status quo? And I think in many ways the Japanese would accept that politically, economically, socially, except that around them the status quo is changing, and that is with the rise of China. So on the one hand, you see a Japan that is starting to lose some of its economic competitiveness to its neighbors. On the other hand, you see a China that's moving into a geographic space that has the potential to seriously challenge Japan's future economy. Even if not in the direct competition for markets, China's maritime expansion potentially puts at risk Japan's supply lines. And that creates a new dynamic in Japan. In addition, you have there's a lot of talk about decline in population, the aging in population in Japan. We're in a very interesting period in between one decline and another decline in population, where there's actually a surplus of and underemployed young labor.
And underemployment is really the core issue. If we were to really nail it down on what is the main thing that is sapping Japanese economic growth and its consumptive potential, it's that underemployment issue. So what basically drove this core issue of underemployment in Japan? And we've seen a number of reforms trying to address it, but have come up short. So for the future, what does that mean? So
there's a combination of issues that played into this. One is a small population rise that was built into the way in which demographics were going. The second, though, is that Japanese companies over time have recognized that cost competitive-wise, it's much better to place their facilities, their factories, their operations overseas. Labor costs are lower. Import of natural raw materials and resources is perhaps lower. Transport cost to final consumer is lower. And so Japanese companies have done very well by moving overseas, but by moving overseas, they're also not employing the Japanese. The Japanese young also have the same problem that's been seen in many of the other parts of East Asia and is emerging in the United States now, in that they're in many ways overeducated and not necessarily educated for the type of employment that Japan was being driven on. So manufacturing employment is not going to be pulling in the master's degree students necessarily, and so the student goes back and becomes a doctorate.
Plus, employing more women doesn't necessarily resolve your demographic issue either, if more people are in the workforce and not having more children.
No, and so Japan has this problem with being able to, in many ways, to metabolize labor at the moment. And going forward, the challenge for the government is to find ways to push that pool of labor into small, medium-sized private enterprises. Try to stir innovation in that space. It's an interesting thing that Japan, South Korea are dominated by these very large corporations that have very close relations with the government. An opposite situation than, say, Taiwan, which is driven primarily by very small, medium enterprises, small bottom-up, and doesn't have that huge overhead. So the capital available, though, for these small and medium enterprises and these startups is really not there, because most of it is directed into these big corporations.
So what I think is really interesting about this assessment is that we're saying there are plenty of internal pressures that are rising, that are driving Japan to sort of break out of the stalemate, break up this very close alignment between the bureaucracy, the main Liberal Democratic Party, and the back and forth between the business groups and the main party. But there aren't a whole lot of big sudden pressures internally that are going to cause that sort of revolution, I guess you could say, economically within Japan. So we're quite pessimistic when it comes to Japan attracting that private capital back, that the corporate power back to Japan. We're quite pessimistic on Japan driving that consumption back up domestically. So really the key is the external environment. And that's where I think it's really interesting longer term what we're looking at for our China forecast and when Japan's demographics really turn severe. So around when does that happen?
So we're really looking another 20 years in the future.
Okay.
When we see things all sort of come to a head. At that point, China may be moving into a much slower cycle. Japan is hitting their demographic crisis. But leading up to that point, the Japanese are being driven in many ways by the change in the overall balance of power. Mm-hmm. So the United States is in some ways withdrawing internationally. After a decade and a half, almost 2 decades of nonstop war, the United States is pulling back a little bit. It's putting a lot more onus on its allies. Japan is positioned as the key ally in the Pacific. China is a power that's moving into that space that's driving the Japanese normalization. Interestingly, if you look in Japan, Abe is leading towards the Abenomics, towards the economic reform program, but he put most of his political capital into the defense and security regulations, which were much more controversial, and pushed those through first.
And they passed.
And they finally passed. And that's the dynamic that actually is pushing Japan. They're hoping, for example, that by doing that, they'll be able to use defense industry as a way to stir a whole new round of innovation, technological innovation, sales, and things abroad. But as you go towards the end of the forecast, we may come to a point where the U.S. reliance on Japan and the U.S.'s moves to build Japan up into this stronger role starts to reverse itself, where the United States sees China in a weakening position and sees a new imbalance forming in the region, where Japan becomes more dominant, China becomes less dominant, and that may alter the way the U.S. wants to play that space.
Okay. So basically, moral of the story is internal pressures in Japan important, but are not the game-changing evolutions that you need to look outside of Japan for how that's going to evolve in the longer term. So thank you, Rodger, for your time today. Thank you all for joining us. We'll have the first in a series of our full report on Japan and the next 25 years. That will be on our website on the 28th. We look forward to hearing your input then.